Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Welcome back, wildlings. Today's story, The Creeping Horror, by EmpyrialInvective. My father was always the most caring of men. I know many of my friends had problems with their fathers at some point. Some were prone to drink, others quick to anger. My father did neither of these things. He had no problem with expressing his love for my mother or for me. He was a jovial, gregarious man who loved life and loved those around him. He had the occasional beer or mixed drink from time to time, but never in excess. He was a very restrained, moderate man. In fact, I can only remember one time he ever yelled at me unfairly. I was young, 10 years or so. I was playing with my friend Benjamin in the backyard. We lived in rural Simsbury, Connecticut. The town was surrounded by mountains and deciduous forests. We were talking about which monster would win in a fight, the tomatoes from Attack of the Killer Tomatoes or the clowns from Killer Clowns from Outer Space. The conversation quickly burnt out when I told my friend in a matter-of-fact tone that neither existed, so it didn't really matter. It was then that my friend turned to me and said, fake monsters aren't that scary. Now, real monsters, they scared the bejesus out of me. I began to suspect that he was about to tell me a bunch of hogwash and try to scare me, but my curiosity overcame me. I had to hear more about this real monster. I paused for a moment before asking him cautiously, "Real monsters? What are you talking about?" Benjamin said, "Don't you know anything, man? Haven't you heard of the creeping fiend?" I answered in the negative, and he told me the story of the creeping horror. My friend began. "They say there's something around these parts, that there's a creature living in the woods. My dad told me he saw it once reach down from the trees and snare a full-grown deer and pull it up into the tree, ripping it apart with its bare hands. And my father would never lie to me." I asked Benjamin, "What does it look like?" "Well, it looks like a man. He's super skinny and it's like he's never eaten. He has an old gas mask on and he wheezes heavily. I've been told he's a soldier that came back from World War II that had his lungs rotted out by nerve gas. I heard that a flamethrower melted the mask to his face, and he can only feed by reducing his prey to a puddle and sucking up the fluids. He wasn't able to live amongst people, so they banished him out into the woods." Benjamin continued, "His name comes from the fact that he skulks around the woods, and no one knows he's there until you hear him wheezing right behind you, but by then it's too late. If you hear him, don't turn around, 'cause he'll get you. Your best bet is to just run for your life. They say he comes out to anyone who calls out his name. If you shout his name 5 times, he'll appear behind you." I was a little scared, but I knew that Benjamin was probably lying to me. I told Ben, "Oh, you're full of it. There's no such thing as the creeping fiend." He quickly retorted, "If I'm a liar, why don't we try calling to him, you big chicken?" I was so angry at being called a chicken that I momentarily lost my better judgment. I don't like to be scared, and there was a likely possibility that I'd easily spook myself and send my heart racing. But I called my friend out. "If I'm going to call him, then you're going to call him with me." Benjamin reluctantly agreed, and we set about calling the creeping horror. Unbeknownst to me, this would set off an irreversible chain of events. And for that, I'm sorry. Benjamin and I stood facing each other just in case he would appear behind one of us. We started out in a barely audible whisper. "Creeping horror." We paused in uncertainty before we continued, a little louder. Creeping horror. My heart was thumping around in my chest. Creeping horror. We went on, practically shouting now. Maybe it was us doing the calling together, but I felt braver. We shouted now. Creeping horror! I sucked in a deep breath to roar the name one last time, but then something stopped me dead in my tracks. The door to my house burst open, and my father flew out into the yard with a look akin to horror mixed with another indescribable emotion on his face. I wouldn't understand that look for many years, and when I could finally comprehend it, I'd tell myself that I'd give anything not to recognize it. He roared, "Stop!" Benjamin broke into a dead sprint, fearing the tone in my father's voice, essentially leaving my ass hanging out to dry. My father gripped me by both arms so hard that I thought my bones would break. He looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Never say those words again. Do you understand? Don't!" I had never seen Dad so worked up in my entire life. At first I thought he was mad at me for shouting. Was he angry at me for playing with Benjamin, who my mother had called a bad influence? That was true. A few years later, he would fall in with the wrong crowd and vanish off the face of the earth completely. Later, it dawned on me what had incurred that fearful look from my father. He was terrified. He was horrified of this creeping horror. He knew something that I didn't. Had he seen the thing with his own eyes? I decided that I needed to get to the bottom of this. I couldn't just ask my dad, so I waited a couple of days until I was alone with my mom to ask if she knew anything about the creeping horror. She looked at me quizzically before responding, "That's just old folklore around here, honey. It's a story parents told their kids when they were younger to keep them from running off." Well, I asked, "Did Grandpa ever tell Dad that story?" She thought for a moment and said, I don't think he ever mentioned it. But yeah, he probably did. I could ask him if you want." I answered in the negative. I had to do some more sleuthing on my own. But I lost interest for a few years. I was a kid after all, and I got easily distracted. 5 years would pass before my interest was renewed. I was a teenager then, and I was constantly in competition with my friends. We always had to prove who was the strongest, the smartest, the bravest. A few of them liked to boast that they had actually gone into the woods and at the top of their lungs called forth the creeping horror. Some embellished the story by saying that they saw him and escaped, while 2 of them said that they had actually kicked his ass. They were quickly singled out as liars. All this talk brought about a resurgence of interest in the old legend. I began tracking the stories back to their roots. I asked my friends where they'd heard the tale, and most of them had heard it from their parents, who had heard it from their grandparents, who had, in turn, heard it from their great-grandparents. I caught one lucky break, though, one day when I was talking to my friend's grandfather. He told me, "Why don't you ask your pa about all of this? He's got his own story. If the tales are true, he lost 2 of his friends when he was out playing with them." He cut himself off and said, "I'm sorry. Old age must have made me a gossip. You ask your father if you want to know the story." I tried to press the topic, but he'd only respond, "Just ask your father." Now, I knew that I couldn't ask my father that. I decided to do a little research with the local library. I didn't know the kids' names or even what had happened to them. I went to the library and asked the ancient librarian if she had any local papers from the 60s and 70s. She looked at me like this was going to be a huge time sink in her otherwise busy life of sitting behind a desk reading Harlequin novels. I held my ground and insisted that I be allowed to view the records. She then huffed and took me back to where the microfiche was stored. Little side note to you. Research using microfiche is in no way fun or intriguing. I wholeheartedly agree with movies opting to montage it and having someone stumble across relevant information within minutes. It took me a week of going into the library after school, asking the same stuffy librarian for permission to use the microfiche, who by the end disliked me so much that her hatred was palpable, and then tirelessly looking through it for hours before I found something. I expected to come across a headline like "Two Youth Mysteriously Vanish," but what I found instead was much more grisly. 2 local teenagers' bodies found in the woods. I read and reread the article until I was confident that this was what my friend's grandfather was talking about. The article in the newspaper discussed the discovery of 2 bodies in the woods. They were badly decomposed and looked like they'd been torn apart by scavengers. They were only able to identify the bodies by linking the parents' missing persons reports with the discovery of the corpses. The 2 missing teenagers were named Alan and Justine. No leads had been discovered, but the police were hopeful. The kids were the same age as my dad and had attended the same school. I exclaimed, "This has to be him! This has to be the creeping horror! He did this!" All of a sudden, I didn't feel so alone in the back room of the library anymore. It was as if the mere mention of his name was enough to call him to me. I quickly left the library, but the sensation of eyes watching me didn't leave until I arrived home. I wanted to talk to Dad, but I was afraid of what might happen. I didn't know what was a worse outcome. He might lose it and scream at me, or he might tell me everything. I quietly ate my dinner and then went to bed. I had trouble sleeping that night. Just as I was nearing that border between sleep and the waking world, I'd hear something that would snap me awake. I'd hear a rasping breath that seemed to be only inches away from me. And I finally decided that I had to confront my dad or find out what was making that rasping sound. My confrontation with my father went poorly. The minute that I mentioned his friends, his face contorted into a look of pure anguish and fear, and he stepped so close to me that I was fearful he'd smash my toes with his feet. He grabbed the collar of my shirt and pulled me close, saying in a tone that could not be disobeyed, "This is not a fun little mystery to unravel. People have died, goddammit. I don't want to hear this type of talk ever again. You understand me?" I left the investigation into the creeping horror alone. My father refused to talk about it, and I realized that the only way that I was going to get the full story of his encounter with the fiend was through him, since the other 2 had died. I had to let sleeping dogs lie. For a couple of nights, I heard the sound of heavy breathing just as I was about to fall asleep. But that eventually subsided. Time continued to pass. I graduated high school, went to an out-of-state college, and the next time I would hear of the creeping horror would be from my father's lips as he lay on his deathbed. It was late during my senior year in college that I received a panicked call from my mother. My father had been in hospice care for the past few months. He had pancreatic cancer, and people who are familiar with oncology know that that manifestation has an 80 to 90% mortality rate, depending on when it was discovered. My father dealt with ulcers all his adult life, or what he thought were ulcers. The cancer crept and metastasized through him until there was very little to do but wait for the end. I drove home as quick as I could, and I found my mother had basically entered a catatonic state after calling me. My father was in bed and creeping towards the end. Dad asked me to give him a little injection of Demerol to help with the pain. I could see from his gaunt body and glassy stare that he was on death's door, so I gave him the Demerol. It took effect almost instantly, and he relaxed noticeably. He told me that he didn't have much longer on this earth and that he had something that he needed to confess. It was then that he told me about the creeping horror and the deaths of his two friends, Alan and Justine. He began when I was in my junior year of high school. I had two close friends. I'd known Alan all my life, and I'd met Justine in freshman year. For 2 long years, I'd had a candle for her, and that was ever since I saw her. Your mother would enter my life much later, in college. Justine was homeschooled until the first year of high school. She and Alan were very close friends. They actually lived next door to one another, and when I learned this, I was constantly pressuring Alan to set us up. He was hesitant, and I sometimes wondered if maybe he carried the same feelings for her, but eventually he relented and set about giving me an opportunity to talk to her. He gave a series of very wet coughs before continuing. One day, Alan invited Justine and I to hang out. We went to his house, packed a lunch while shooting the shit. We eventually decided to have a picnic out in the woods, go exploring. We knew of the creeping horror myth, but none of us really believed it. I was ecstatic to have this opportunity to make my feelings for Justine known. We really didn't know each other socially, so the only opportunity I had was through the medium of Alan. He played the role perfectly, and he introduced us, and then we ventured out into the woods to explore. We quickly tired of exploring the woods and settled down for lunch in the bag that I'd been carrying. I carved up some bread and cheese, and we ate while making small talk in a small, idyllic clearing. I kept glancing over at Justine. I couldn't help it. Looking at her just took my breath away. I had a serious case of puppy love. When we'd finished with lunch, Alan suggested that we have some fun and try calling the creeping horror. Justine was at first opposed to the idea, but she quickly relented when I agreed. I desperately wanted to prove myself to her, and this seemed like a viable way in the moment. We all faced each other and began to call him. We needed only shout his name 5 times, so we began creeping horror. My eyes focused on Justine, and a smile played across her face. Creeping horror. I knew that I was madly in love with this girl. Creeping horror. Her face had dissolved into uncertainty at that point. Creeping horror. Her face was sheer terror now, and she broke away from us, screaming. She had apparently heard some heavy breathing somewhere. She ran off, and Alan gave me that commiserating glance that I should probably be the one to comfort her. I pursued her through the woods and found her a little while later. She was close to breaking down in tears and was insistent that she had heard that breathing right behind him. I soothed her with comforting words, and when she'd calmed down, I made my feelings known. I told her that I wanted to go steady with her. She accepted my feelings and agreed to go on a date. Before returning to Alan, I planted a kiss on her. My first kiss. It took my breath away. We returned to Alan and were getting ready to return home when he made the challenge. He wanted to complete summoning the horror. My father paused then for a second, and I wondered if he was going to continue with the story. He decided in the affirmative and proceeded. I had no further desire for tomfoolery, but Alan was insistent. Justine was terrified. I realized that he wasn't going to back down, and finally consented. But I stipulated that we call the horror as far away from Justine as possible. I didn't really believe in the superstitions, but I didn't want to scare her any further. She agreed to wait in the clearing while Alan and I proceeded further into the woods for this fool's errand. We decided that it would be better to call the creeping horror on our own, far away from each other, so we walked in opposite directions until we could barely hear each other. I wanted to be far enough away from Justine that should something spook me, I wouldn't embarrass her or myself by crying out like a little child. He asked if I was ready, and I answered yes. I swear to God that I'd give anything to never have agreed to tempt fate like that, but yeah, that ship has already sailed. So we began calling his name, Creeping Horror, and the forest was deadly quiet. Our second invocation, Creeping Horror, sent our echoes rebounding through the woods. I heard a twig snap in the distance. I figured it was the wildlife in the area being startled by our shouts. But I went on. I shouted a third time, Creeping Horror! There was a rustle close by the underbrush. Whatever it was getting closer to me. I called again, Creeping Horror! I could have sworn that I smelled sulfur. We went on. Were we on hunting grounds out here? Was I smelling gunpowder? I sucked in another breath and gathered myself before shouting one final time, Creeping Horror! I literally roared it that last time, and I had to take a few seconds to catch my breath. When I did, I realized that I wasn't the only one breathing heavily. It was almost negligible at first, but slowly it grew. Before I knew it, the sound was a few yards behind me. And yes, it was the sound of breathing, and it sounded like it was coming through some sort of breathing apparatus. I spent a few seconds thinking that it was my overactive imagination, but the sound grew louder and closer, and I knew that if I turned around, it would attack me. I knew that this was really the horror. The sound of labored breathing grew closer until it was just a few feet behind me, and I willed everything in my body to run, but I was paralyzed where I stood. Fear and panic had washed over me like a tidal wave. I knew that if I tried to run, the fiend would be on me in a second. It was so close. I could hear the dry rattle in its lungs as it huffed and puffed behind me. I knew that my only option was to fight. I had brought my pocket knife for the bread and cheese with the lunch. I slowly slid my hand towards my pocket, and the sound of breathing was just inches away now. My fingers glanced over the pocket knife, and I pulled it up into my hand. Now I could feel the breaths heating the back of my neck. I tightened every muscle in my body to prevent pissing myself and voiding my bowels. I had to act quickly or I'd be consigned to death by the creeping horror. I didn't want to be reduced to nothing but a splatter on the bed of the woods when I had so much life left to live. I was in the grasp of the creature now. It rasped in a low, gravelly tone that went right into my ear. I'm so hungry. I wanted to run, wanted to plead. I wanted to be back at home. I thought that I was going to die out there in the woods. And then he asked for another shot of Demerol, and again I relented. He nodded his thanks and then continued. I felt the thing's hot breath on me, and I knew that I was at its mercy. It leaned in close to my other ear and said, "Your flesh will be mine." That was all it took. I whirled around and I stabbed out behind me, and the blade pierced flesh and caught on something. The creature stumbled backwards, and as the adrenaline drained away from me, I realized what I had just done. Justine laid on a bed of leaves, gurgling wetly. The blade had pierced her throat just below the jawline. She writhed in a panic and clutched at the bloody knife. Before I could get to her, she pulled the blade out, and blood spurted from the wound. My father paused to compose himself before continuing. I knelt by her, and I put pressure on the wound, but it was too deep, and it was so bloody and slippery. And I told her I loved her. She just gurgled in shock. Shortly after that, she simply died, bled out. I wept for a few seconds before I heard Alan exclaim, "Jesus Christ! What happened?" The pieces slid into place. She had wanted to scare me. She crept up behind me, breathing heavily like the creeping horror legend. She had only wanted to play a joke on me. Alan knelt at the body and pressed a hand into the ragged wound, and he took her pulse with his other hand. He paused a few seconds as if time would prove him wrong. It didn't. He turned back towards me, and he was in the process of telling me, "She's dead, we have to call the police," when I stabbed him in the chest. He tried to stumble back and crawl away, but I was on him with my pocket knife. I raised the blade several times, and I brought it down into his body. The third stab slipped between his ribs and pierced his heart. I'd panicked, and in my fear of being caught in a prank gone awry, I killed my best friend and my girlfriend. I listened to his tale in shock. He told me how he left the bodies where they lay. He told me of the months spent in anticipation of being revealed by the police. That time never came. He said it all with a sense of quasi-relief and shame. He spoke of the guilt that had grown in him, which was compounded by my inquiries into the creeping fiend. The very thought of that memory rent wounds deep in his soul. It was only now that he was able to confess his crimes because he was himself so close to death's door. My father, the benevolent, loving man, had 2 deaths, the weight of 2 souls on his mind. He'd spent 30 years with that secret, and no one to tell it to. It had eaten away at his conscience for 30 fucking years. And when he'd finally told someone, I doubt it eased the pain of it all. He wanted to cleanse his conscience, but he was afraid of the consequences. It was then that I learned my father was a coward. He couldn't face the consequence and bring consolation to the 2 families of his friends. He had fled from the truth, and with time the crime had eventually become cold, unsolved. The man I saw as my hero, my role model, was nothing more than a coward. He asked for another shot of Demerol, and I gave it to him. I plunged the syringe into the small, rubber-stopped bottle, and I withdrew the entire solution. My father watched me with bright, delirious eyes. I leaned in close to him and whispered, "I love you." He mumbled something about Justine, but he was slipping further away each second. I'd already given him so much of the drug, just a little bit more was all I needed. I pierced his arm with the needle, and I injected the entire needle into him. My last memory of him was looking into his face. He was so eerily similar to the emotions he'd showed me that one day so long ago when I had tried to call the creeping horror with my friend Benjamin. The emotions he expressed were that of unbridled fear, uncontrollable guilt. He died looking that way. I'm writing this now because I know he's dead. I killed him. He slipped away peacefully after an overdose of Demerol. I know that the families of Alan and Justine deserve some sort of respite. They deserve justice, but that time is gone. Finally, now, their killer can be revealed, and at the end of it all, I'm ambivalent. There are two conflicting emotions here. My childhood admiration and respect that I have for my father, the man who raised me, and the horror of the terrible secret that he bore for over 30 years. He was my idol, and he was also a fiend capable of unspeakable horrors. I won't conclude the story by saying there was never a monster, because that's not true. The monster wasn't something as simple as flesh and blood, nail and fang. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a creature. The monster isn't isolated in the small town of Simsbury, Connecticut. It's everywhere. It was, and it is, a part of us. All of us. The creeping horror was my father the day he accidentally murdered his girlfriend and stabbed his best friend to death to protect himself. The creeping horror was me that night when I gave him that fatal overdose. In some horrible way, the creeping horror is inside all of us. It's in who we are, what we can become, given circumstances that are entirely out of our control. So thanks for listening to the end, wildlings. As much as I'm not a fan of humanity, I think the world would be a much better place if everybody just learned to keep their creeping horror to themselves. Stay scary, my wildlings, and make the most of your nights.